Let me begin with a simple fact about international law. When a nation declares a total blockade of another nation's ports, when it positions an armada to prevent vessels from entering or leaving those waters, that action has a specific legal designation. It is called an act of war. Not aggressive posturing, not escalatory rhetoric, not even a gray zone operation. Under the laws of armed conflict recognized since the 19th century, a naval blockade is indistinguishable from a declaration of hostilities. On December 17, 2025, President Trump announced exactly such a blockade against Venezuela. The largest deployment of American military power in Latin America since the Cold War is now positioned off Venezuela's coast. And what I want to make absolutely clear from the outset is this: the stated justification for this operation, stopping drug trafficking, does not align with the scale of forces deployed, the strategic assets committed, or the president's own words about what he expects Venezuela to surrender. This is not counter-narcotics. This is not even primarily about removing Nicolas Maduro from power, though that is certainly an objective. This is about something older, something more fundamental to American strategic thinking in this hemisphere. It is about reasserting control over resources that Washington has long considered within its sphere of influence. And the fact that this assertion is being made through military force, in violation of international law, with minimal congressional oversight, and against a nation that poses no military threat to the United States, tells you everything you need to know about how far American foreign policy has drifted from the principles it claims to uphold. The numbers matter here because they reveal intent. 15,000 American military personnel are now operating in and around Venezuela. That is not a counter-narcotics task force. That is an invasion-scale deployment. The USS Gerald R. Ford, America's newest and most advanced aircraft carrier, is on station. Its strike group includes guided missile destroyers, submarines, and support vessels capable of sustained combat operations. Alongside the carrier are amphibious assault ships carrying Marine expeditionary units. These are not platforms designed for intercepting drug smugglers. They are designed for forcible entry operations, for establishing beachheads, for projecting power ashore. The military has also deployed F-35 Lightning II fighters, fifth-generation stealth aircraft optimized for penetrating advanced air defense systems. Venezuela does not have advanced air defenses that would require F-35s to overcome, but the deployment signals capability and intent. Then there are the EA-18G Growlers, electronic warfare aircraft specifically designed to suppress enemy air defenses in preparation for deep strike operations. Their presence indicates planning for missions far beyond coastal interdiction. According to military analysts, this configuration, F-35s plus Growlers plus carrier-based strike aircraft, is what you deploy when you are preparing to conduct airstrikes on targets deep inside hostile airspace. That is not the profile for stopping speedboats carrying cocaine. Since September, this force has conducted what the military calls lethal kinetic strikes against vessels in the Eastern Pacific and Caribbean. At least 104 people have been killed in these operations. The Pentagon describes them all as narco-terrorists. But no evidence has been provided. No manifests showing drugs aboard the destroyed vessels. No arrests, because everyone aboard was killed. No legal proceedings, because the strikes occur in international waters, where the vessels, whatever they were carrying, had every legal right to be. International law experts have been remarkably clear on this point. What the United States is conducting are extrajudicial executions. Killing people without trial, without evidence presented in any court, based solely on executive determination that they were engaged in drug trafficking. If Russia conducted similar operations, sinking vessels and killing their crews in international waters based on unproven allegations, Washington would call it piracy and demand United Nations action. But when America does it, we are told it is a necessary response to the drug crisis. Now, there is no question that drug trafficking from Latin America into the United States is a serious problem. Fentanyl and other synthetic opioids have killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. Cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin continue to flow across borders. But here is what every serious analysis of the drug trade confirms. Interdiction does not work. Destroying supply in one location simply shifts production and trafficking routes to another. The economics of the drug trade, high value, compact product, enormous profit margins, make it nearly impossible to interdict your way to success. The successful approaches to reducing drug deaths are domestic, treatment, harm reduction, addressing the socioeconomic conditions that drive addiction. But those approaches require long-term commitment, significant investment, and political will to treat addiction as a public health crisis rather than a criminal justice problem. It is far easier, politically, to deploy aircraft carriers and announce that you are getting tough on the cartels. It makes for better television. It avoids the hard questions about why American demand for drugs remains so high. And this brings us to the actual strategic objective, the one Trump stated explicitly in his announcement of the blockade. Venezuela must return to the United States, quote, all of the oil, land, and other assets stolen. Not drug interdiction, not democracy promotion, not even regime change as an end in itself. The demand is for Venezuela to surrender its natural resources and sovereign territory to the United States. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia. Estimates put the total at over 300 billion barrels. At current prices, that represents tens of trillions of dollars in potential wealth. For most of the 20th century, American oil companies operated freely in Venezuela, extracting enormous profits. Then, in the 1970s, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry. American companies lost direct access, though some, like Chevron, maintained limited operations through special arrangements. Since Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, Venezuela has used its oil wealth to pursue policies independent of Washington's preferences. It has provided subsidized oil to Cuba and other Latin American nations. It has aligned with Russia, China, and Iran. It has criticized American interventions in the Middle East and supported movements challenging U.S. influence in Latin America. For these reasons, Washington has sought to isolate Venezuela economically, undermine its government politically, and now, apparently, seize its resources militarily. The Trump administration has imposed sanctions that have devastated Venezuela's economy. Oil production has collapsed. Hyperinflation has destroyed the currency. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country. The humanitarian toll has been immense. And yet, Maduro remains in power because he has managed to secure alternative trading partners, primarily China, and because the military and security apparatus remain loyal, partly through force, partly through the understanding that if Maduro falls, they fall with him. So, the sanctions did not produce the desired regime change. The next escalation was designating Venezuela a state sponsor of terrorism, then designating Maduro's government itself as a foreign terrorist organization, an unprecedented step that blurs the distinction between states and non-state actors. And now, a naval blockade, with explicit demands for Venezuela to surrender its sovereign resources. Let us be very clear about what the Monroe Doctrine, the 19th century policy that declared Latin America off-limits to European powers, actually meant in practice. It was never about protecting Latin American nations from colonialism. It was about establishing an American sphere of influence where Washington, and only Washington, could intervene. The Roosevelt Corollary made this explicit, granting the United States the right to exercise international police power in the Western Hemisphere. For more than a century, the United States has intervened in Latin America repeatedly, overthrowing governments in Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua, and Haiti, supporting dictators who served American interests while brutally repressing their own people, training security forces that committed atrocities against civilian populations, imposing economic policies that enriched American corporations while impoverishing local populations. This history does not exist in the distant past. It shapes how every Latin American nation views American power today. And now, we have returned to this logic with overwhelming military force. The largest armada ever assembled in South American waters, according to Trump's own description. A blockade, which is an act of war. Strikes that have killed over 100 people. Demands for Venezuela to surrender its oil and territory. And the justification offered is stopping drug trafficking, even though no evidence links the majority of people killed to actual drug operations, and even though the military assets deployed are configured for regime change, not counter-narcotics. The regional response has been telling. Brazil's President Lula has publicly expressed concern about Trump's actions and offered to mediate. Mexico's President Sheinbaum has called on the United Nations to intervene to prevent bloodshed. Latin American nations remember American interventions. They remember CIA coups and death squads. They see a carrier battle group off Venezuela's coast, and they understand this is not about drugs. It is about power. And many of them, even those with no love for Maduro's authoritarian government, find themselves deeply uncomfortable with the precedent being set. Because here is the strategic reality that should concern everyone, including Americans. If the United States can declare a blockade, an act of war, against a nation it is not at war with, based on unproven accusations of drug trafficking, and demand that nation surrender its natural resources, what prevents other great powers from doing the same? China already uses economic coercion extensively. Russia has shown willingness to use military force near its borders. If American exceptionalism, the idea that we alone can act outside international law because our intentions are good, becomes the global norm, we are accelerating toward a world where might makes right and international law means nothing. Now, some will argue Venezuela is different. Maduro is a dictator. His government is corrupt and incompetent. The Venezuelan people are suffering under his misrule. All of this is true. But the solution to dictatorship is not American military intervention. That approach has failed repeatedly. Iraq after 2003, Libya after 2011, Afghanistan after 2001. In each case, the removal of a dictator through American military force led to chaos, civil war, terrorism, and instability that persists to this day. In each case, hundreds of thousands of people died. In each case, the promised democratic transformation never materialized. Why would Venezuela be different? What makes anyone believe that a country devastated by years of economic sanctions, with its institutions hollowed out, its economy in ruins, and its population divided, would somehow smoothly transition to stability and democracy after American military intervention? The far more likely outcome is what we have seen before. Initial military success followed by occupation, insurgency, mounting casualties, and eventual withdrawal, leaving chaos behind. And there is another dimension to this that must be addressed. Congress has not authorized military action against Venezuela. The War Powers Resolution requires congressional approval for sustained military operations. Yet here we have 15,000 troops deployed, a carrier strike group on station, over 100 people killed in strikes, and now a blockade declared. The legal justification offered is that these are counter-narcotics operations under existing authorities. But a blockade is not a counter-narcotics operation. It is an act of war. Members of Congress from both parties have expressed concern. Some have introduced war powers resolutions to clarify that the president lacks authorization for these actions. But these resolutions face an uphill battle in a divided Congress, and even if passed, enforcing them against a president determined to act is difficult. What we are witnessing is the gradual erosion of congressional war powers, the constitutional authority that is supposed to prevent presidents from unilaterally launching wars. The precedent being set is dangerous. If a president can deploy this scale of force, conduct lethal strikes, and impose a blockade without congressional authorization simply by labeling it counter-narcotics or counter-terrorism, then the restraints on executive power in matters of war have effectively disappeared. Future presidents will cite this precedent. The ratchet only moves in one direction. Let me address the question some will ask. What is the alternative? If Maduro is a dictator presiding over a humanitarian catastrophe, if Venezuela is indeed involved in drug trafficking as alleged, if the situation is genuinely intolerable, what should the United States do? The answer begins with honesty about what our actual interests are and what outcomes are realistically achievable. If the interest is reducing drug flow into the United States, then the effective approach is domestic. Treatment, border security focused on ports of entry where most drugs arrive, and diplomatic engagement with source countries on alternative development programs. Military blockades do not stop drug trafficking. They redirect it. If the interest is alleviating Venezuelan suffering, then sanctions that devastate the economy are counterproductive. Humanitarian assistance, support for civil society, diplomatic pressure coordinated with regional partners, these are the tools that might actually help the Venezuelan people without adding military intervention to their burdens. If the interest is promoting democracy and human rights, then consistency matters. The United States maintains close relationships with authoritarian governments around the world when it serves other interests. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and various other nations with poor human rights records receive American support. The selective application of pro-democracy rhetoric undermines its credibility. But if the actual interest is control over Venezuela's oil reserves, then let us at least be honest about it. State it clearly. Make the case that American access to Venezuelan oil is a vital national interest worth going to war over. Put it to Congress. Let the American people debate whether securing foreign oil reserves justifies military action. Because doing it through the back door, calling it counter-narcotics while demanding Venezuela surrender its oil and territory, insults the intelligence of everyone paying attention. The risk of escalation is very real. Venezuela has mutual defense agreements with Russia and China. Both nations have economic interests in Venezuela, particularly in its oil sector. China holds billions in Venezuelan debt. Russia has maintained a military presence, conducting exercises and providing equipment. Neither nation wants American military control over Venezuela's resources. So far, Russia and China have limited their response to diplomatic statements and warnings. But if American forces move from blockade to strikes on Venezuelan territory, if the operation expands from sinking boats to regime change operations ashore, the risk of Russian or Chinese involvement increases. Not because either nation cares deeply about Maduro, but because allowing the United States to militarily seize resource-rich nations sets a precedent neither can accept. We are also seeing the beginning of regional pushback. The deployment has united much of Latin America in opposition, even among nations that typically align with Washington. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, all have voiced concerns. If the United States proceeds with the blockade or expands operations, regional isolation increases. That makes every other American objective in Latin America, from trade to immigration to security cooperation, more difficult to achieve.
And then there is the question of what happens inside Venezuela if the conflict escalates. Does the military remain loyal to Maduro, or do officers see an opportunity in chaos? Do disparate opposition groups unite, or do they fragment and fight each other? Does the country hold together, or does it splinter along regional and ethnic lines? Does violence remain contained, or do we see widespread bloodshed? None of these questions have reassuring answers based on historical precedents. What I find most troubling about this entire operation is the casualness with which the most serious decisions of war and peace are being made. The announcement came via social media, no address to the nation laying out the stakes and the strategy, no presentation of evidence to Congress or the American people, no consultation with allies, many of whom are discovering American policy through news reports rather than diplomatic channels. This is not how serious nations conduct serious statecraft.
When you are deploying 15,000 troops and declaring a blockade, when you are taking actions that risk war with a nation that has backing from nuclear-armed powers, when you are demanding that a sovereign nation surrender its territory and resources, these decisions deserve more than a truth social post. And this points to a deeper problem in American strategy. We have lost the ability to distinguish between interests and preferences, between what is vital and what is merely desirable, between what can be achieved through military force and what requires other tools of statecraft. Every problem looks like a military problem. Every challenge invites a military response. And the result is overstretched forces, dwindling resources, mounting casualties, and a world that increasingly sees American power as reckless rather than stabilizing.
The truth is that Venezuela does not threaten the United States militarily. It cannot project power beyond its borders. Its military is poorly equipped and trained. Its economy is in ruins. Even if every allegation about drug trafficking is true, and the evidence for most of these allegations has not been made public, that still does not constitute a threat requiring a carrier battle group to address. What Venezuela represents is a challenge to American dominance in its traditional sphere of influence, a government that refuses to align with Washington, that uses its oil wealth to pursue independent policies, that provides an example, however flawed, of resistance to American pressure. And the response, a massive military deployment and blockade, reveals that what we are defending is not security, but hegemony. The costs of this approach accumulate. Every intervention, every occupation, every regime change operation that ends in chaos undermines American credibility. Every violation of international law that we justify through exceptionalism weakens the rules-based order we claim to defend. Every unilateral action taken without allied consultation damages the relationships we need for actual collective security. And the human costs are borne by people who have no voice in these decisions. The Venezuelans who will die if this escalates to war, the American service members who will be sent to fight it, the families on both sides who will mourn, the refugees who will flee, the economies that will be devastated. None of them were consulted. None of them voted for this, but all of them will pay the price. So where does this end? If the blockade continues and Venezuela does not yield, does the United States expand to strikes on Venezuelan territory? If strikes begin and Maduro still does not fall, does the United States commit ground forces to remove him? If ground forces go in and Venezuela fragments, does the United States occupy the country to prevent chaos? If occupation occurs and insurgency follows, how long do we stay? These are the questions that should be answered before the first shot is fired. But they are not being asked, let alone answered. The lesson of the last 2 decades should be clear. Military force can destroy regimes, but it cannot build nations. It can create power vacuums, but it cannot fill them with stable governance. It can eliminate leaders, but it cannot conjure competent successors. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, every case proves this.
Yet here we are again, deploying overwhelming force, making maximalist demands, and assuming somehow it will be different this time. It will not be different. The pattern is clear. Initial military success, regime collapse, chaos and violence, protracted occupation or premature withdrawal, long-term instability, thousands of deaths, trillions spent, and at the end, a situation worse than when we started. The alternative is not doing nothing. It is doing things that actually work. Diplomacy, economic engagement, support for civil society, regional cooperation, multilateral pressure. These tools are slower, less dramatic, harder to sell politically, but they do not leave countries in ruins. They do not require occupations that last decades. They do not violate international law or undermine constitutional restraints on executive power. But if we are going to continue down this path, if blockades and interventions and regime change operations are truly the policy, then at minimum we owe ourselves honesty. Stop calling it counter-narcotics when it is about oil. Stop pretending it is humanitarian when we are starving populations with sanctions. Stop claiming we are defending democracy when we are overthrowing governments. Just admit that the objective is control and the method is force. Because the current approach, maximum pressure wrapped in noble rhetoric, is the worst of both worlds. It produces the costs of intervention without the honesty of imperial conquest. It violates principles while claiming to defend them. It undermines order while invoking stability. And it does all of this with such casual certainty that we have stopped even questioning whether it might be wrong. The blockade of Venezuela is not primarily about drugs. It is not even primarily about Maduro. It is a demonstration of power, an assertion that America's sphere of influence extends where we say it extends, and that nations within that sphere must comply with our demands or face military consequences. That is the message being sent to every nation in Latin America and beyond. And the response to that message will shape international relations for years to come. Some nations will accommodate American power, concluding they have no choice. Others will seek protection from rivals, accelerating the formation of a bloc opposed to American dominance. Still others will pursue nuclear weapons, deciding that is the only reliable deterrent against intervention. None of these outcomes serve American interests. We are at a decision point. Continue down the path of military primacy, unilateral action, and regime change operations, or accept that American power, while still considerable, is not unlimited. That international law applies to us as well as others. That Congress, not the President alone, decides questions of war. That some problems cannot be solved by deploying carriers and declaring blockades. The path we are on leads to more wars, more interventions, more chaos. It leads to a world where international law is meaningless, congressional authority is hollow, and military force is the answer to every challenge. That world is not more secure. It is less. Not more stable. Less. Not more prosperous. Less. The blockade of Venezuela should be a wake-up call, a moment to ask hard questions about where American foreign policy is heading and at what cost. Instead, it is being treated as just another crisis, just another deployment, just another assertion of power. And that, more than any specific decision about Venezuela, reveals how far we have drifted from strategic thinking toward strategic drift. The bills for failed strategy are paid in blood. The Venezuelan people will pay. American service members will pay. And ultimately, American security, credibility, and constitutional governance will pay. All for an operation that begins with a lie, proceeds through violations of law, and will almost certainly end in outcomes nobody wants. That is not strategy. It is recklessness masquerading as resolve. And it needs to stop before the costs become catastrophic.